one of the great glories of a great university is the life of the mind and the arts that it cultivates. And in recent months, in addition to our really splendid Longwood plays and performances, we've also welcomed the American Shakespeare Center, Virginia's Poet Laureate. Next week we've got the Richmond Symphony coming. And tonight we inaugurate our, is my microphone not working? Tonight we inaugurate our leadership forum. We've got the illustrious Jeff Schapiro here with us. Though unfortunately, of course, the last few weeks in Virginia politics have been very uneventful. In just a second, I'll turn things over to our own Justin Pope, who will serve as host and Grand Inquisitor, who will give a formal introduction to Jeff. I wanted to say a quick but very big word of thanks to Diane Easter, who has organized this series, organized tonight, Brenda Adkins. You all have done a wonderful job, and this will be a great thing for Longwood in the months and years to come. So welcome, everyone, and Justin, the stage is yours.
So a couple very quick notes before I introduce Jeff. Afterward, there'll be a reception in the Hager room just outside here, where you're welcome to continue the discussion. Jeff's going to speak for about maybe 30 minutes or so, and we'll see how it goes, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A here in the auditorium before that. Also, some of you have already gotten a mailer about the next event in this series, which was to be Richard and Kathy Verlander on February 27th. Unfortunately, they have had to cancel, but the good news is that Dr. Charles Sidner, a former Longwood professor who is now the director of the Virginia Holocaust Museum, will be here that evening, so that will be a great next step in this series. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce one of my personal mentors as our speaker tonight. I first met Jeff Schapiro when I was a student intern at the Richmond Times-Dispatch. I worked a few steps away from the spectacularly cluttered desk of Mike Allen, later of the Washington Post, New York Times, Time Magazine, and finally the co-founder of Politico. And next to Mike was Jeff, already by then the dean of the Virginia Politics Press Corps. And listening to the two of them work the phones was the sharpest learning curve that I had in journalism. Jeff and Mike took me under their wings. When I finished school, Jeff suggested I learn the ropes at a wire service, just as he had done, covering Virginia for United Press International before he joined the Times-Dispatch in 1987. I got a job at the Associated Press, where I ended up staying for 14 fascinating years until just a few months ago when I decided to return home to Virginia to work here at Longwood. I offer this story here at Longwood as testimony that internships, such a key part of the student experience here, truly can change the course of your career. Of course, interns don't always get the most glamorous assignments. While Jeff was tormenting the George Allen administration with his hard-hitting political columns, I was dispatched to South Boston for a feature about an elderly lobster named Stanley. An animal rights group was demanding that Stanley, on account of his advanced size and age, be freed from the lobster tank of the local Walmart. And over the years, as Jeff and I have corresponded and grabbed coffee from time to time to catch up, he has never once failed to bring up that story and to mock me for it. Tonight, I exact small revenge by introducing Jeff to this audience with a little-known fact. He was born in New York City, but since graduating from Georgetown University, he has become a Virginian through and through, from his bow tie down to his toes. His now 25-plus year tenure at the Times-Dispatch has coincided with a remarkably eventful and transformative period in the Commonwealth's political history, which is something I know he'll be speaking about tonight. Jeff's column is carried by other Berkshire Hathaway papers across the state, and many of you listen to him on Richmond's public radio. And those of you who read The Economist will know that while that publication does not carry bylines, it does carry a disproportionate number of wry articles about Virginia politics. And that agreeable imbalance reflects its good fortune to have a stringer here whose wit, rhetorical dexterity, and fashion sense fit perfectly with the style of that august publication. Finally, a very brief word about Jeff's important role in Virginia in the context of Longwood's mission of producing citizen leaders. Accountability journalism is the lifeblood of democratic citizenship, and state governments have a tremendous impact on our everyday lives. But unfortunately, while the ranks of reporters covering every corner of Washington and Wall Street have swelled, in recent years, coverage at the state level has been eviscerated by the economic changes sweeping the media industry. Just a few short years ago, in State House press rooms across the country, you'd find reporters from numerous wire services and perhaps a dozen or more newspapers in frenzied competition. Today, these rooms are depressingly empty. Many of the reporters who remain lack the resources and experience to do more than cover politics as horse race electioneering. Left undone is the painstaking work of helping the public understand the policy choices they face and the investigative projects that hold public officials accountable. Certainly, recent events in Richmond remind us of the need to shine light on the actions of public officials. Earlier this month, the Washington Post published a list of the most important state government reporters, and needless to say, Jeff Schapiro represented Virginia on that list. But you should know that not every state has a Jeff Schapiro, an aggressive but fair reporter on the state government beat with a deep Rolodex and a genuine grasp of local history, who is held in respect and even healthy fear by the powers that be. Virginia is extremely fortunate to have Jeff Schapiro working on our behalf, and Longwood is extremely fortunate to have him with us tonight to share his thoughts on Virginia's political landscape on the occasion of a new administration, the 9th by my count that he will hold to account. Thank you. Jeff Schapiro.
Thank you. I am not worthy. Thank you, Justin. That was breathtaking. I'm not sure I recognize the fellow you introduced. I'm going to have to defend myself somewhat. Justin made reference to the story that he did on this ancient lobster, for which he's personally responsible, saving from dinner. And because Justin has always had a way with words, even before he decided to allow journalism to ruin his life, he included a second reference to Walter that has since become his nickname. And I'm afraid I've gone too far to retreat. The lobster, on second reference, was known as the venerable crustacean. Ergo, Justin, to myself and those who toiled with him in Virginia, when you were a 10th grader, or no, actually that was when you were a proper intern, I guess, at the Times-Dispatch, forever know Justin as the venerable crustacean. President Reevely, I don't think I've seen an individual that tall in cowboy boots since George Allen left office. You are full of surprises. We were discussing, several of us were discussing by phone and at dinner earlier the good fortune of Longwood to defeat Liberty yesterday in basketball. I tried this line earlier. I'll try it again. Apparently, evidence that God is indeed on Longwood's side. Much has been going on in Virginia politics in the past 96 hours that I suspect have a lot to do with the larger picture, and I will try this tonight. But let me start with something that President Reevely said that I think nicely plays into some of the points perhaps we can discuss tonight. In his inaugural, President Reevely said that this area of Virginia was where the Civil War ended and civil rights began. And not far from here in Richmond, civil rights appear to be expanding. Today, actually it was wired up last night so that he would generate the maximum amount of attention. The new Democratic Attorney General, Mark Herring, announced his refusal to defend Virginia's constitutional prohibition on same-sex marriage. Now, this is an important gesture by the Attorney General, and perhaps it moves Virginia closer to 17 other states in allowing legal, civil, same-sex marriage. I would suggest that this is a reflection of Virginia's changing politics, and that is a reflection of changing Virginia. And there are several cases in point. The first of which would be Prince Edward County itself. This was the seat of the segregationist movement. It is now a speck of blue in a sea of red, twice falling for President Obama, and in November tipping to Governor McAuliffe. Case in point, the corruption indictment of former Governor McDonald and his wife Maureen, a reminder that politics in Virginia is no longer the purview of a small, privileged class. It's now a game that is open to the everyman, including in this instance a destitute father and mother of 5, and their calamitous finances, the Department of Justice suggests this, left them vulnerable to the, shall we say, glittery overtures of a rich businessman hoping to become even richer. Case in point, the pressure on public higher education, in particular at Virginia's supposed flagship university. I choose my words wisely, supposed flagship. The University of Virginia, and its clear shift from the Jeffersonian Academy emphasizing liberal arts, an entity accountable to a diverse constituency, to essentially a Wall Street subsidiary, becoming something of a trade school for financiers and high-end lawyers, and largely accountable to one-percenters in New York City, Greenwich, Connecticut, and Houston. And Mrs. Reevely, I jotted that down unaware of your pedigree. I think that the explanations for this are demographic, but largely arithmetic. Consider what Virginia was. In 1900, this was a state with a population of about 2 million. 90% of the people who lived here were born here. The economy was largely agricultural. The state was very poor, reeling from Civil War debts. By the way, investing in the Confederacy, which seemed a promising venture at the time, ruined the finances of any number of entities, including the College of William and Mary, run by another branch of the Reevely clan. This forced William and Mary, at that time a private school, to surrender its charter to the state, becoming a public school. This was in 1906, after 212 years as a private entity whose origins were in the British Crown. Fast forward to 2014. The population of Virginia exceeds 8 million. At least 50% of the people who live here were not born here, present company included. This is the 12th largest state in terms of bodies. It's got the 11th largest economy. Its economy is now thoroughly dominated by the service industries, of which government is the largest part. Roughly a quarter of our economy is a consequence of the beneficence of the federal government and the state government. 66% of the people who live in Virginia live in the suburbs. And that template was roughed out, or initially roughed out, through the industrialization immediately before and during World War II. But at that time, then 66% of the people who lived in Virginia lived in the countryside. So this is a very dramatic shift, and it's also one reflected by the diversity of Virginia's population. In the war years, and really well into the 70s, for the most part, Virginians were black or white. There are Native Americans here as well, but there was a an unusual man at the Bureau of Vital Statistics who was trying to write them into extinction by lumping Native Americans in with African Americans, largely part of his view that these were inferiors. This was a man named Walter Plecker, who was also one of the brains behind the eugenics movement in this state. But now Virginia is a genuinely multi-huge place. The voting rolls have grown exponentially. Ron Heineman, who is here from down the road at Hampton-Sydney, has looked closely at this growth in his work on the birds. To give you an idea just how spectacular this growth has been, in 1945, the first gubernatorial election following the Second World War, this is when Virginia was becoming this bustling place, for governor, only a total of 145,000 votes were cast. Now, there were any number of reasons for that, principally bias in the laws that kept African Americans and poor whites off the rolls, but in November, over 2 million votes were cast. And that's out of a potential pool of 5 million. 5 million people are now registered to exercise the franchise here. The consequences of this growth have made for a somewhat schizophrenic Virginia. And just looking at the period from 2001 forward, the Democrats and the Republicans have been mostly competitive, particularly for the governorship. Yet even when the Democrats were getting up ahead of steam, in 2001, Mark Warner winning, in 2005, Tim Kaine, there was always this kind of conservative, default Republican undercurrent in Virginia. I think a good example of that would be the 2006 referendum on that constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. 56% of Virginians voted in favor of that referendum. And now, 8 years later, public opinion polls, admittedly curiosities, snapshots in time, suggest that now better than 50% of Virginians favor same-sex marriage. The state is very much a work in progress. In 2008, Barack Obama carried Virginia comfortably. His majority here pretty much mirrored his majority nationally against Senator McCain. Barack Obama was the first Democrat to carry Virginia for the presidency since 1964, when, let the record show, another Reevely was a college president down the road at Hampton-Sydney. But in 2009, the year after the president was elected, Bob McDonnell, a Republican, was elected in a landslide. And in short order, he was a national prospect. He openly positioned himself for consideration as Mitt Romney's vice presidential running mate. I can only ask how the mighty have fallen. In 2012, Barack Obama carried Virginia again, his performance pretty much identical to that in 2008, statewide and nationally. The division in Virginia pretty much reflecting the country, 52% Democrat, 48% Republican. And then last year, in November, Terry McAuliffe wins for governor, a Democrat, and leads the first Democratic sweep for statewide office since 1989. Also ends the Virginia curse. Since the 70s, and this has always been a kind of a leading or lagging indicator, depending on your perspective of national preferences, the party that wins the White House loses the governorship. The reasons, I think, for these split results they're primarily two. In Virginia, where we have an election every year, and that's rooted in our history, largely to insulate state politics from the cross-currents of national politics, Every year we have another election, we have a different electorate. And here's where turnout is key. So Barack Obama carries Virginia, carries Prince Edward County, and comfortably, but look at the turnout. 74% of those eligible to vote bother to show up. But Bob McDonnell wins in a sweep the year after the president wins. Look at the turnout, about 40%. It's just a reminder that the game is controlled by those who get on the field. Another important factor, redistricting. Redistricting has allowed for the slicing and dicing of the electorate. It's created artificial advantages for the elective class, Democrats and Republicans. It essentially allows the elective class to shop for voters as opposed to voters shopping for their elective representatives. And this creates the landscape on which this new Democratic governor is trying to do business. The House of Delegates has a substantial Republican majority, 2-1. It is now heavily rooted in the countryside. The boundaries of the districts, Democratic and Republican, are drawn in such a way that they tend to maximize the strengths of the narrowest bands of the electorate. So typically, if you are a Republican legislator, you have to worry about your challenge is likely to come from your right as opposed to somewhere in the middle. If you're a Democrat, the challenge is likely to come from on the left than somewhere in the middle. The problem that this creates for the legislature and the governor that is trying to engage it is that the members tend to talk past each other as opposed to with each other. And you can see this in the selection of bills that are being pushed through the Assembly. Dr. Witchey reminded me of a piece of legislation pressed by a rural Republican, Dickie Bell, from up Stanton Way, that would essentially get Virginia out of the business of teaching science. It's an important bill to conservative Republicans in the greater Augusta County area. Today in the Senate, there was a debate over a piece of legislation that essentially rewrites the history books. By the way, this was pushed by a liberal Democrat. There's a large and growing community of Korean Americans in Northern Virginia. They are very concerned that references to the body of water that separates Japan and their homeland is commonly known as the Sea of Japan. But anyone growing up in Korea or with an appreciation of Korean history knows it's known as the East Sea. If this bill gets through the legislature, then school children, as part of the SOL process, and we should talk a little bit about it, will be informed that that body of water separating Japan, the country that conquered the Koreas, is not only known as the Sea of Japan, it's known as the East Sea. A big bill, not just because of purposes of identity, but if you're a member of the elective class, you want to be able to call on this growing and growingly prosperous group of new Virginians. The primary issue pushed by the new governor, as he kind of gets his arms around this place he knows as Virginia and this government that bears no resemblance to the one he's dealt with in Washington, D.C., is to expand the state's Medicaid program primarily to bring up to 400,000 Virginians, uninsured Virginians, under Obamacare. To the Republicans in the House, this is a non-starter. I don't need to remind you the very strong differences of opinions between Democrats and Republicans on the president's health care initiative. But one of the things that the Republicans are hearing, and they're trying to reconcile this with the positions that their constituents demand they take, is that in rural Virginia, health care is becoming increasingly remote, increasingly scarce. Lee County, its only hospital, was recently shuttered. A number of hospital chains through rural Virginia have been announcing layoffs and reductions in staff, largely because of the uncertainty in Richmond over health care financing. I would suggest that one of the things the Republicans, particularly in the House, will have to reconcile is how do they provide health care and how do they assure their political survival? I wonder if, as this debate unfolds, if you're going to start seeing both sides repackage it. What we know now as Medicaid expansion will be called something entirely different by the time it comes out the end of the legislative pipeline, presumably in mid-March. The other thing that is a wild card in Richmond now is the House of Lords, as we call it, the state Senate. Normally the more collegial of the two bodies, increasingly very House-like in terms of its partisanship. Before the statewide election, there was a 20-20 split. Two state senators were elected to state office, Mark Herring, the Attorney General from Loudoun County, and Ralph Northam, the Lieutenant Governor from Norfolk. By the way, Ralph Northam is a native of the Eastern Shore. He is the first Eastern Shoresman, Marianne Radcliffe, your rector, who has deep Eastern Shore roots, running all the way up to the Delaware end of the peninsula. And I've talked about this. If Ralph Northam is elected governor, he would be the first Eastern Shoresman to hold the governorship in Virginia since Henry Wise, who was the governor of Virginia when the Civil War erupted. So there's useless information for you. But with that 20-20 division in the Senate and a Republican lieutenant governor as the presiding officer and casting the tie-breaking vote, the Republicans, in effect, have had working control of the state Senate. There have been two special elections for those vacant seats, one clearly won by a Democrat, the other we won't know for sure until Monday. The presumed winner, Linwood Lewis, a Democrat from the Eastern Shore delegate, has a whopping majority of 9 votes. That will go, as I said, to recount on Monday. So assuming the Democrats restore their 20 seats, with Ralph Northam sitting as the lieutenant governor and the tiebreaker, look to the Democrats to force some changes in committee memberships and, more to the point, committee chairmanships, and look to the Republicans to push back. As I said, the Senate is not nearly as lordly a place as it once was. It's entirely possible that we could see things done in the Senate that civics professors only write about. For example, to free bills from hostile committees where they would typically die, the Democrats, for example, might bring bills directly to the floor of the Senate. It's known as discharging the committee. The Senate would sit as a whole. I don't know that this is going to make for great government. It's going to make for marvelous theater. One of the other issues that the legislature will be dealing with, largely because of this terrible embarrassment for the Republicans, is ethics reform. One of the reasons Governor McDonnell is in trouble is because Virginia's conflict of interest laws are porous and inexact, and they ultimately rely on self-policing. Using Governor McDonnell as an example, when the stories first broke about his relationship, and more to the point, the beneficence of Johnny Williams, the governor, and because lawyers can be very artful in their prose, said that he had disclosed everything in his conflict of interest statement that he, the governor, had received from Mr. Williams in the governor's capacity as chief executive. We have since learned that there were many things that were given to the governor and his immediate family that were not disclosed. That was his prerogative under Virginia law, because if you look at a conflict of interest statement, it says you don't have to list the gifts you receive from family members and personal friends. It doesn't say who makes that distinction. It leaves it to the individual who's filling out the form. And it is behind this screen, the federal government argues, that this scheme in which Mr. Williams, the former head of Star Scientific, was allegedly putting the squeeze on the McDonald's to help him get state support for his magic diet pill, as Rachel Maddow calls it. Actually, I don't know that I've seen it in pill form. I've seen it largely in liquid. I am not so sure that the legislature is really going to be able to come up with much, and I think there are a couple of reasons for that. The Democrats, I suspect, have something more ambitious in mind than the Democrats, but I think it's safe to say that both parties are concerned that anything too onerous will discourage people from an interest in elective office. I tend to be a little bit cynical and skeptical about these things. I suspect a lot of it has to do with the fear of elective officials that they could find themselves in a calamity similar to Bob McDonnell's. And as long as they don't criminalize this behavior, they can trot along merrily. So that is going to be an issue that will keep the legislature amused. Certainly, I suspect it will do a great deal to kind of feed the doubts and the skepticism of the public. This being an institution of higher learning, Virginia's third oldest, what Virginia's legislature does for higher education is also a concern. The departing governor was somewhat generous, something north of $100 million for higher education. He also has you all in the stepping up your degree dispensing capacity. This is something with which Governor McAuliffe also agrees. The idea is that Virginia needs to produce more degreed people because of its changing economy. Put an asterisk next to that. It's not so clear it's really changing. And I think that is going to be a bit of an issue in the 2014 election, if we have one. Mark Warner, a popular former governor, is in the closing months of his first term. He'll be standing for re-election. And the Republicans have this idea that Mark Warner is vulnerable, and that Mark Warner, under the right conditions, can be defeated, and if not defeated, at least taken down a peg or two. This year, Virginia will choose members of the House as well as a U.S. senator. There won't be a president on the ballot. There won't be a lot to generate the attention of the electorate. And so there is this evolving, unfolding, odd coalition of Republicans who are betting that a Republican Terry McAuliffe can run against Mark Warner and maybe beat him. Ed Gillespie, former chairman of the Republican National Committee, a former lobbyist, a fixer by Washington standards, a man to see, someone who is skilled at getting politicians to do things, often by helping them raise money and organize their campaigns, is running for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate. It's interesting, there are some other parallels to the McAuliffe campaign, keeping in mind that one of Terry McAuliffe's big talking points as a candidate was that he and his wife had lived in the same house in Northern Virginia for 21 years. Now, by Northern Virginia standards, I guess that's probably several lifetimes. But I remember when a young, dark-haired fellow by the name of Chuck Robb decided to run for lieutenant governor in 1977 and was accused of parachuting into the state. He and his wife prepared a family tree that showed that, at least on Governor Robb's side of the family, his roots reached back at least 200 years into the Commonwealth's history. I don't know that being a lobbyist is necessarily a positive given what has occurred in our politics. And I don't know whether some of the more, shall we say, moderate positions that Mr. Gillespie has taken, including support for an individual mandate under health care, will necessarily endear him to Republican activists, which leads me to believe that if he is nominated and maybe he doesn't run, perhaps his next move will be modeled on Mark Warner's. And that is Mark Warner, running credibly against his country cousin John Warner, suddenly found himself the putative Democratic nominee for governor in 2001. I'm wondering if Ed Gillespie has something similar in mind for 2017. I filibustered. I've talked too long. I'm much more interested in what you all have to say. And so let's take infield practice.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. How about a round of applause just for I believe we have some students in the back who will have microphones, and maybe I'll ask the first question, and if anybody else you want to raise your hand, call attention, and somebody will bring a microphone to you. Please ask about any subject. I just ask that in fact you ask a question. There's no such thing as a question in the form of a comment, so please make it concise. I guess just to get us started, I'd like to hear you, this is a leadership forum, and we have a new governor. I'd like to hear you riff a little bit more, perhaps psychoanalyze our new chief executive. Tell us something we don't know or might surprise us about him and his leadership styles that translates into expectations you have for how he will fit into the culture of Virginia politics in Richmond and whether he will be effective.
Well, you know, the election for governor seems like ancient history, and based on what has happened in the past few days, I think it really is. Terry McAuliffe was elected governor not because of his brilliant communication skills, his unusual personal story, his incandescent smile. I think he was elected largely because of who he wasn't. The Republican nominee, Ken Cuccinelli, scared the hell out of a lot of people. He scared the hell out of a lot of Republicans, or enough Republicans that who weren't prepared to vote for him or were prepared to vote for Terry McAuliffe or even Robert Sarvis, the Libertarian candidate who ran remarkably well just because he wasn't the other guy. McAuliffe is definitely trying to get his arms around this job, considering he had been shopping for a governorship in at least 2 other states, Florida, his wife's home state, and New York, his. And, you know, I say this as a New Yorker. That's my cross to bear. But I was pained listening to the new governor's message to the legislature. He made several references to a major city in southeastern Virginia spelled Norfolk. And even as a come here, I know that the preferred pronunciation is Norfolk. It came out probably 4 or 5 times as Norfolk. It was an ouch moment. I don't know that the governor is necessarily interested in accomplishing a lot of things. I think he's interested in accomplishing something that looks good on a marquee or a billboard or can be conveyed in about 30 seconds. I don't know that that's necessarily a negative. I think it's very much a reflection of what particularly elective executive leadership has become. There's only one governor. He commands a good deal of public attention, relatively good deal of attention, good deal of positive attention. And I think he is he's just looking to close that deal. And if he comes across on television as a bit of a car salesman, that's because he is. He famously invested in this electric car company, the factory of which is kind of sputtering along, perhaps a poor choice of words, in Mississippi, where he apparently got better terms than he had hoped to receive in Virginia, though the record shows Virginia wasn't much interested in him. The governor wants to be loved. And I think it frustrates him that as he attempts this abbraccio of Virginia, that Virginia is not necessarily responding. Stay tuned. I think the real test of someone like a Terry McAuliffe is the ordinariness of the governorship, running the state, making sure services are delivered, that agencies, particularly high-profile, very visible agencies like the Department of Motor Vehicles or the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control, function. And we've yet to see that in this governor now 2 weeks on.
Right. Jeff, you can have a seat if you'd like, or stand, whichever you prefer.
I'll stand.
Let's start with this gentleman and then this lady in the back.
Given the problems that both of the gubernatorial candidates brought in their background, do you think that the advances of the Libertarian Party was an anomaly, or might we expect some more growth out of that statewide?
I think it was an anomaly. The parties, for the most part, remain fairly potent in Virginia, at least in terms of voter identity. I think, and I just touched on this, I think this is one of the reasons why McAuliffe ultimately prevailed. One of the things that he emphasized as he was putting together the nuts and bolts of his campaign, identifying voters, informing them, and mobilizing them. He was trying to cast the Obama net as far as possible. And if you look at the pattern of returns, his margin came out, his winning margins came out of the areas where the president was strongest. I wonder, and I sort of worry about this because, and again, I'm the come here, and converts are terrible about these things. I fear that Virginia's politics, even local politics, when we are typically choosing among our friends and neighbors, are becoming increasingly national. One of the reasons the Republicans ran as strongly as they did in that special Senate election in Norfolk is that all they talked about was Obamacare. Frankly, that's been a very strong selling point for Republicans. One of the reasons Ken Cuccinelli closed as strongly as he did against Terry McAuliffe coming off of a government shutdown, which had a spectacular effect on Virginia's economy, is that he was able to harness Republican voter anger over health care reform. Even voters who were Republican voters disinclined to support Cuccinelli because of his position on social issues were sufficiently steamed about Obamacare that they came home. That's trickling down to the local level. I don't know that that's good. And I don't know that it will make it any easier to solve problems, because ultimately that's what, you know, the elective class is all about.
This lady in the back row had her hand up.
Recently, a bill was introduced to the Senate, the Virginia State Senate, and it was Senate Bill 507, which would essentially eliminate nominating conventions, at least in the Republican Party. And there's a lot of upset about that in the grassroots movements. How do you feel about that?
Well, you know, the Republicans are trying to get back in the game. Right now, their beachhead, for lack of a better description, is the House of Delegates. They have a majority in the U.S. House delegation from Virginia. That's a consequence largely of redistricting. But the concern about the nominating process is that it produces the least likable, the most unelectable candidates for the general election. Case in point, E.W. Jackson. Anyone who sat in that auditorium up the road in Richmond on that rainy Saturday morning knew that when the candidates' names, those seeking the lieutenant governor's nomination, were called out, the place exploded when E.W. Jackson's name was mentioned. The Republicans are trying to position themselves. To get that bill through, though, is going to require the votes of Democrats. And, you know, why should the Democrats protect the Republicans from themselves? They're doing such a great job, the Democrats would argue, of destroying themselves. Politics is cyclical. The Republicans will be back in the game. One of the most interesting thoughts I've heard expressed kind of backstairs on that is that the Republicans, the more moderate Republicans who would like to see the party get out of the convention business, have told Democrats that they'll go along with this expansion of Medicaid for Obamacare if some Democrats cross over and support this convention bill. I don't really think it's going to go anywhere. The Republicans in the House of Delegates are not keen on that at all. But I think the bottom line there is, how far should a state go in telling parties how to manage their business? There have been some important issues in that area over the years. For example, Republicans typically charged a fee to people who attended conventions. That was challenged successfully in the federal courts as the equivalent of a poll tax. So now the Republicans have a voluntary fee. It's, you know, shaded, packaged a little differently. But my guess is that Republicans will be free to make that choice between conventions and primaries, continue to be free to make that choice.
This lady in the back, and then this gentleman right here.
So I was curious about a sort of question that I've had about Republicans, specifically how in Governor McDonnell's administration it seemed to me, being admittedly a non-Republican, the national Republican agenda being played out in our little Virginia politics. I was wondering the degree to which you think that that is true, and I'm specifically talking about abortion. And in a larger question, I might have a two-part question. Why are we talking about abortion rights? Where did it come from? Because it didn't come from me. It came from politicians. That's my premise anyway.
This issue continues to ripple through our politics. It will be an issue addressed by the new governor. As I'm sure most of you remember, there was a somewhat contentious and at times sort of humorous struggle within the Republican Party last year over legislation requiring women who were planning to terminate pregnancies to undergo a compulsory, medically unnecessary vaginal exam before having an abortion. The McDonnell administration was very concerned about this and the message that it sent, and what it was trying to do was somehow peel away the seemingly more offensive features of the legislation while allowing the governor to remain true to his anti-abortion views. And what the Republicans came up with is essentially the jelly on the belly alternative. Earlier, of course, there had been another piece of legislation signed into law by Governor McDonnell that required that abortion clinics in this state, of which there are about 24, actually there were 24, I think there are now 22, that they would have essentially construction and maintenance standards that were identical to those for hospitals. At least 2 clinics have closed, saying that they can't afford to refit under those standards. Let's just set that aside for a moment, because that's I think, a sleeper for the McAuliffe administration. Abortion remains, particularly in the Republican Party, a defining issue. It is not an issue on which a Republican can take a gray position. And given the makeup of the Republican Party, but in particular, the makeup of the caucuses and the conventions and the primaries that determine nominations, a candidate cannot afford to be seen as soft on abortion. So that's why this remains a very important issue in the legislature. It's important for Republicans because it keeps them engaged. And frankly, it's important for Democrats because it keeps them engaged. Because a lot of the people who show up at Democratic primaries, Democratic caucuses, and Democratic conventions are as firm in their support of abortion rights as Republicans, many Republicans, not all, many Republicans tend to oppose it. Sadly, and again, this is a reflection of what has happened because of redistricting and the increasingly national nature of state politics, there are very few members of the legislature who are kind of somewhere in the middle on that. It's made it difficult to really come to terms. Back to the clinic issue. This governor will have, and I would suggest that this speaks to the ordinariness of a governor's job, but the extraordinary implications that it can have. This governor is going to appoint a health commissioner. He appointed an interim health commissioner today. This governor is also going to appoint new members of the Board of Health. These people are important in terms of seeing to it that abortion clinics are safely and properly operated. But you know, remarkable things happen when there's a new lineup. Suddenly paperwork slows down. Suddenly things aren't enforced with the vigor and brio that perhaps the previous administration might. So I think that will be an opportunity for this governor to affirm his abortion rights credentials and slow this move to a more restrictive environment.
I think we have time for one more. Did this gentleman have his hand up?
Yeah. Can you tell us where the power to gerrymander resides and what the prospects are for a re-gerrymandering, at least toward neutrality, if not toward Democratic dominance?
You mean, you mean small d or large d Democratic dominance?
Yes.
The Constitution and the courts have made it very clear that redistricting is the responsibility of legislative bodies. There has been a huge body of case law developed on this at the federal level and the state level. The Virginia Constitution makes several references to districts and their characteristics. These are not the exact words, but that districts should be compact and they should be contiguous, that they should have communities of interest. Obviously, Prince Edward County and the town of Farmville have shared interests. But I haven't looked at the boundaries in this area. Perhaps Farmville has been split in two. I don't know. That's one of the confusing consequences of redistricting as we know it. I mean, I'll travel around the state and I'm scratching my head half the time. I'm not sure in whose district I'm standing. There was a big push ahead of the most recent redistricting in 2011 to get Bob McDonnell to commit to something more than just nice words about apolitical, nonpartisan, bipartisan, whatever you care to call it, redistricting. There was a group of business people, former elected officials, former governors, one of whom, Jerry Beliles, for whom President Reevely worked, who made the case to the governor to come out in favor of some mechanism to assure, shall we say, less of an abomination when it came to drawing the legislative map. This group wangled a meeting with the governor, and one thing about Bob McDonnell, he can be a very attentive host, and from every indication, he listened carefully, and he asked a few questions, and he gave this group a lot of time. And then when it was his turn to kind of say his piece, one person in the meeting, two people in the meeting actually told me this. He said, the governor said he'd read the Constitution very carefully, and he'd looked at the case law. And the one word he didn't see in anything was competitiveness. He said districts can be compact, they can be contiguous, there can be communities of interest, but they don't have to be competitive. And that's what we've ended up with. And frankly, if one considers what arguably is the high watermark of the McDonnell administration, this fix for transportation, $6 billion in new taxes over 6 years, one of the reasons the governor had such difficulty getting that bill through the legislature, and one of the reasons he had to move the tiles around the board the way he did, what he proposed and what he signed were very, very different, is because of redistricting. These boundaries, particularly these Republican boundaries, had given, again, a disproportionate amount of influence and power to anti-taxers. So there were a lot of people who ordinarily would have been Bob McDonnell's friends who weren't going to cross that line because their political futures relied on it. And as a result, that transportation initiative was, the deciding votes were cast by Democrats. It was arguably the most bipartisan accomplishment of an administration that fancies itself bipartisan, but for the most part was pretty partisan. So redistricting has created something of a monster, and I'm not sure that that things are going to change anytime soon. I would note that this new governor, has made a pitch for an incremental move to a less political, a less partisan redistricting exercise, but I don't know that the legislature is much interested in listening to him on that. Thank you very much. Happy New Year.